Harrison's Reality Check.
And it is the top of the hour. Cary Harrison with you. I want to thank Michael Benner, by the way, for, I want to be that relaxed and cool during life. It may be the ageless wisdom that he's got, but I'm telling you, he sounds like he has really got it together, and I am admittedly jealous. Well, what can I say? We're going to be talking to some very smart people upcoming. But first, I just want to talk to you directly, and I want to talk about Ukraine, and I want to talk about what's really going on at the same time. There are many things really going on. Oh, did I introduce myself? Cary Harrison here with you. I got caught up in Michael Benner here. You can follow us at any time at goharrison.com, goharrison.com, and across all social media at goharrison. See a video copy of this and every other broadcast within a couple of hours after the end of this show on kpfk.org. You'll hear the audio anyway. You'll also be able to see the live video stream on Facebook, where we post that, and then also on KPFK, you'll see a copy of this broadcast, as well as on goharrison.com. So I was thinking about Ukraine. I lived in Switzerland for 4 years, so the neutral country of the planet, and went there as a kid in boarding school and learned a lot. John Kerry went there, and he is not considered a layabout, a sloth. That doesn't mean it's a great place, but at least it's got a few superstars. Nonetheless, I learned a bit about diplomacy just by being around that milieu and being around some adults that were involved in that level of business. And my fascination, which I think is your fascination too, is I love mystery history. I love the stuff that they will not teach you in school. Won't do it. Not going to tell you that stuff. Now, it's not that the brilliant teachers know all of this historical data and they just refuse to share it with you. They don't actually know it. How do I know this? A story that I've told before, about 15 years ago, I took the West Coast bureau chief of the Associated Press. Wow. There's a guy who's got it all. Whatever he needs to know, snap his fingers, bam, there it is. What happened in 1873 at 4:15 p.m.? Bam, snaps his fingers, there it is. And I asked him something that you're familiar with. I said, how come I haven't seen in the last 10 years a single mention of DU, depleted uranium? Nothing. Nothing at all. And people are sick all over the Middle East, and U.S. service people are returning with horrible cancers and problems. And I'll give you the quick primer on DU, and then I'll circle back to my point here. DU, depleted uranium, is the output of a nuclear power plant. It spends the uranium. In other words, it uses it like a battery. It gets used and then it gets drained. It still has a little something in it. And that little something lasts about 500,000 years, by the way. That's depleted uranium, not the kind that you want in the plant. It's the kind that was in the plant and is no longer good. This is the same stuff that nobody wants in Nevada. Nobody wants anywhere within 1 million miles of where they live for any reason, no matter what, especially where there's earthquakes and floods, etc. Because you get a little Fukushima love, and that's the love that never, ever goes away once you've been exposed. So it sits in these basically Sears Craftsman sheds. It's shocking to you. It's shocking to me to be reminded over and over again. What? Yeah, they went out and they spent as little as they could to pile these bad boys up. So the Energy Department and the Pentagon got together a bunch of years ago and realized that it's a very dense heavy metal. It also is deliciously radioactive, and it puts out just enough to just screw you up for the rest of your natural life. And if you coat a bullet or a bomb with it, it will slice through a tank like hot butter. Wow, nothing else will do that. So we've been coating bombs with depleted uranium and dropping them all over the Middle East. And yeah, it cuts through tanks, it does this, but each time it explodes, it aerosolizes, releasing millions of microscopic metallic particles that float through the air and lodge in the lungs of the person breathing them. That includes our own people, because guess what? It aerosolized near enough by, and the wind blows and it spreads all over the Middle East, and people have this gamma radiation in their lungs. So it's a low-level nuclear war. Why do I mention this? Because the history or the information, here I am presenting to the West Coast Bureau Chief of the AP, who can summon all information about all of humankind ever written down, says to me, "What's DU?" And I nearly choked on my salad and spat it right in his face, which would have been a reasonable activity. He did not know what depleted uranium was. I could not believe it. I was gobsmacked. And I asked him, so I explained the whole thing to him. I said, how is it you have not heard of this? He said, well, I've just never heard of it. Is it true? I said, boy, is it true. There are lawsuits. There are tens of thousands of military people dealing with it. It's certainly known all over Europe. It's talked about. Vieques in Puerto Rico, the home of the paper towel in recent years. Another great proving ground for blowing that stuff up. They're not allowed to anymore because they're restoring to the natural environment, the mangroves and the other things that were just bombed to smithereens. That you'd think he would have known about, but he didn't. So this is my point. There is not a big conspiracy, not the kind you think, not a big conspiracy to spike information. They hire people and give them huge amounts of responsibility, and they're in charge of the information, but they are not the kind of people that are interested in the information that you actually need. Another example, and I am getting to my point here. When I was in Chicago on WMAQ, which was a CBS owned and operated all news station, I was brought there from Tampa Bay at the time, and they were grooming me to be the young Paul Harvey, and they just didn't know my politics. How do you not know? Well, they liked, the way you tell the stories is, this is Paul Harvey. I'm like, okay, let's go. And so I would do stories on what's in Lake Michigan. And Chicago is Illinois. Get rid of Chicago and you got a red state that does nothing. A couple of corn cobs. So it's all about Chicago. Well, 2 miles off the end of Navy Pier, a lot of you have been to Chicago. You've certainly seen pictures. There's a big pier at the end with a Ferris wheel on the end. It's called Navy Pier. And in the summer, let me tell you, they do summer in Chicago the way they do summer in Boston with the Boston Pops and everything else, because you get like 2 months of summer, and every night is a hootenanny. So at the end of Navy Pier, during World War II, the Manhattan Project, the famous Manhattan Project that allowed the U.S. to complete production of Fat Man and Little Boy, or the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The University of Chicago was helping with the heavy water experiments. And when they ended up making large vats of really pernicious radioactive potion, where are you going to put it? I mean, think about it. Where are you going to put this stuff? Kind of like the depleted uranium. They don't want it in Nevada. They don't want it in Greenwich, Connecticut. They don't want it in Lake Forest, Illinois. They don't want it in Grosse Pointe, Michigan. They don't want it in Palm Beach. Where are you going to put it? Well, build a tin hut, stick it in there, right on the campus, right near the damn thing, and then let some weeds grow up around it and nobody will even know, which is what most of us don't even know. So the Manhattan Project, University of Chicago, has these gigantic vats of extremely toxic, poisonous, radioactive, hideous water. So they decide just to dump it in Lake Michigan, which is a giant, toilet. At least it was. And as I was growing up in Chicago, we had signs on the beach, do not swim in Lake Michigan. Like, the thing is massive. It's even got a tide, like a whole inch. It's massive. Don't swim in Lake Michigan. There was so much DDT and poison that you could not eat the coho salmon because it was like a mercury butt thermometer swimming. I mean, everything. And the DDT, which, by the way, this is one of the reasons that the Paul Harvey thing didn't work. I would do stories on, even though DDT has been banned in the United States, if you're younger, you may not have heard of DDT, but it is the world's greatest effective insecticide. It'll kill everything. And it works great. Gets rid of all the bugs off the fill in the blank thing that you're growing out there. And it kills it all. And it'll give you cancer and kill you too. It is the worst stuff ever made. So it's not legal in the US, but it is legal in Mexico. Thanks to NAFTA. This is one of Bill Clinton's happiest treats and tricks that made everyone so happy. So in Mexico, they're spraying all the crops with DDT. And then we have the same seasonal issues where everything dries out and it blows up in the air and the jet stream brings it right over and dumps it into Lake Michigan. So double the pleasure, double the fun. So I would do stories like that. And then Mayor Daley would call up, say, you'll get this guy, no more nature stories, no more like that environmental stuff. Yeah, you got to, cut it out. That's how he talked. Probably still does. And so they had me start doing Hollywood stories from Chicago. Now, that's pretty cutting edge. A week later, like, yeah, from Chicago, here's what happened in Hollywood today. And who cares? So they found their way. That said, people don't know what they don't know and therefore can't teach it. And so it's important to understand that with history, such as Ukraine and other things, it's not as though the people at CNN don't know what's really going on. Well, they actually don't know what's really going on because they're not at that level. Example, Don Lemon. Seriously, I want you to soberly, seriously think about Don Lemon. Not like, well, we need to be a fan because, no. Look at that. I mean, that is just like regressive second grade level. And he doesn't know nothing from nothing. And neither does Anderson Cooper per se, but he's a good interviewer, a good talker, a good TV presence. Why is Ukraine interesting to the Russians? The same reason Chile is interesting. The same reason that the Galapagos is interesting. The same reason that a few other places in the world are interesting. It is one of the few places on Earth. California is the other of the three. So Chile, California, and Ukraine can grow 4 different types of crops at the same time. It has that kind of weather, that kind of environment, and that kind of value. And under Stalin, what did he do? We're going back to the post-revolution. Stalin decided it is the breadbasket for Russia. Russia sucks. It's frozen. We can't cook anything, make anything, grow anything. It's cold. It's awful. It's terrible. Ukraine, you can grow everything. It's beautiful. It's awesome. So we know what Stalin did is he wiped out millions of people, literally starved 20 million people to death in Ukraine and took all their food, took everything. So they were literally acting as slaves in that communist party, that version of communism, a different version of, say, Cuban communism, which is actually polite and lovely and friendly. And I'm not saying Fidel Castro is great. I'm not saying that. But it's not. Go to Cuba. Find out. I took a group of KPFK listeners to Cuba, the last cruise before Donald Trump pulled the plug. Took physicians, took everyone, and we saw it for what it is. And they share and they live well. I'm not saying it is the best way of life. I'm saying it's not what you're told, which is Cuba should be bulldozed because they're the worst things in the world. They're not. They have a different version of something, which was born of a revolution, as was the Russian Revolution. Cary Harrison with you. This is Harrison's Reality Check. You can follow me anytime at GoHarrison, at GoHarrison. You can go to GoHarrison.com, where you'll get a copy of video of what you cannot see right now because it's live. Also on kpfk.org, there'll be a video posted later on. Upcoming, if all goes well with our connection here, we'll be talking to Lindsay Koshigarian. And she is going to explain the recent exploding military budget. I mean, it's going to blow your mind. And why? At the expense of vaccines, at the expense of everything. What's going on with Biden and why? Back to Ukraine. So 2014 comes around in Ukraine, democratically elected president, and Joe Biden, at the time vice president, is in charge of unseating that guy's ass and changing stuff around and putting in through the Pentagon some of our BSL 3, BSL 4, biosafety level 3, biosafety level 4 labs for to surround Russia with bioweapons. So that part is true. Do they love it? No. Do you and I love it personally? No. Is it a great idea? No. But it's it. That's not why the Russians are in there. They have always traditionally seen Ukraine as one of these three places on the planet that allows for unlimited growth of crops, water and agriculture. Bottom line, water and agriculture. So Ukraine has it all, just like Chile has it all, just like California has it all. World War II, the Nazis. And I see my guest is popping up, so I'm just going to ask her to hang on there for a few minutes. We'll get to her very, very shortly. The Nazis, there was something called Lebensraum, Lebensraum. And Lebensraum, or living room, it literally translates to living room, was something that the Nazis came up with, the Fuhrer and all of his chums, which was every German could have a nice chunk of land in Ukraine and become a very successful farmer and live in a hospitable climate where you can grow everything, unlimited water, and it's a massive, giant place. So that's why the Nazis went after Ukraine, because they had seen what Joseph Stalin was able to do in butchering, murdering, slaughtering millions, starving them to death. Because when they were growing food for Stalin, who ran the Soviet Union, they were paid in maybe a potato, but 99% of it all had to go back to the Kremlin, all had to go back to Moscow. None was allowed to remain. And if the Red Army found that you were keeping, a couple of asparaguses and a pork loin or whatever, you were dispatched, which is polite language for put away permanently, dirt nap. Yeah, that's how they ran it. And it worked, and it fed the Soviet Union. So here we are back again with Vladimir Putin creating a new Soviet Union. He's not bashful about it. He talked about it 15 years ago, said the only thing in the way is Ukraine. Just 3 years ago, he had a giant parade, full Soviet uniforms, full Red Army marching to the Soviet national anthem. Just something fun. So this guy sees it. He thankfully was given beautiful permission and all the opportunity he could ever want from our former president, Donald Trump, who will have a Trump Tower someday, I'm sure in Moscow as a reward, maybe a couple in Ukraine when it gets rebuilt. And the Russians don't care. If they have Ukraine, they can grow and do anything, and all the resources there. So that's kind of part of the plot of the play. There's much more, and that's why we go to the adults in these situations and don't rely purely on my memory and perspective. I want to introduce to you Lindsay Koshgarian. I said it right, didn't I? Give me a thumbs up. Did I say it right, Koshgarian?
Koshgarian.
Well, I at least get 4 points. I was close.
Your LA listeners, some of them will recognize the Armenian name.
Oh, are you kidding? You bet. You bet. We are Armenian. We're an Armenian city, among many other things. So Lindsay Koshgarian is program director of the National Priorities Project, which just released a statement. Biden 2023 budget puts war before human need. War before human need? How could she possibly mean that? Well, she's talking about prioritizing violence, the military, and war over peace and human needs. And we are seeing full-on real-time war happening right in front of our own eyes. Is the solution, as we're told in states like Florida, if there's too many shootings, go buy more guns and just arm your grandmother, and that takes care of it. Do we have any evidence that ever de-escalated shootings? No, we don't. But more spending on militarism can't address the nations of the world's problems, and we got problems, baby. Part of Ukraine is climate change. That's part of it too. Nestle owns over 30% of Earth's water. Nestle! You know, Nestle makes the very best. That's a Swiss company, Switzerland, the size of Rhode Island or less. 30% of Earth's running water. So we know who's got the love and who wants it and why they're going there. And anyone who gets in the way, as the Nazis taught us, have to go away. $813 billion. Biden's request for the Pentagon exceeds even the $782 billion budget the Congress just passed by $31 billion. This increase alone is twice the amount that Congress refused for ongoing COVID aid for antivirals, vaccines, and tests after nearly 1 million Americans have died of the virus. So with that introduction, let's welcome Lindsay Kashgarian. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
I just threw out an hors d'oeuvre. Clearly, there is an entree to come, and I'm missing so much of all of this. But our budget, our military budget, is like 13 times the size of the GDP of most countries, most nations, most anything, most of history. I mean, it's mind-boggling. People don't even know.
No, it's true. People don't really understand the scale of our military budget, and $813 billion, clearly that's a big number, but it's not a big number that people have, we don't have a lot of things to compare it to. Most of us don't have a lot of other billions of dollars numbers floating around in our heads. But for reference, that chunk of what we call the discretionary budget, that's the budget that Congress allocates every year when they do their, every year Congress does a budget, every year they have to pass something to keep the government running. That's what this is. More than half of it every single year goes to the military. And then the less than half of it is left for everything else. And that's, public schools, it's homelessness, it's affordable housing, it's public health, it's scientific and medical research. All of that has to squeeze into the rest of the budget because so much of it goes to the military.
We've heard recently that the U.S. military budget, more than the next 11 countries combined, 12 times more than Putin's Russia, higher than at the peak of the Vietnam War or even the Cold War. So if more militarism were the key to a stable and secure world, we would have been there back in the Roman days.
That's
no
right.
doubt. Here we are 2,000 years later, and we just can't believe what we're watching on we believe what we're watching on TV, but my God. So you also point out that the U.S. has deported more than 5 million people over the last 20 years, and the president's budget request also continues the precedent of militarizing immigration policy, so that immigrants are met with violence, detention, and surveillance. This is Joe Biden. We wouldn't want to believe that, and we wouldn't have guessed that's the case. But can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So clearly the last president had a militarized immigration policy and, sent troops to our southern border and all of those things that we heard about. And there was family separation, and it was just terrible, inhumane, cruel immigration policy. The problem is that things haven't really changed all that much under President Biden. And in fact, President Biden is looking for 300 additional Border Patrol guards at the southern border over what we already had. And just so that, just for comparison, we already have many, many times as many Border Patrol guards as we had 20 years ago. So we've just been adding more and more of these Border Patrol guards. And they're not just folks who are there to turn people around. They have military drones that they work with. They have military grade weapons that they use. This is a real militarized force. It, in fact, is one of the largest law enforcement agencies in the world is just our Border Patrol. So it's a huge militarized force. Folks have died trying to cross the border. Folks have died in custody. And it's not a humane way to meet people who are coming for reasons a lot like the Ukrainians that we all are, feeling so much for right now. They're coming from places with violence or corruption and poverty. They're fleeing violence. They're fleeing states that aren't safe and settled. Right now we're all seeing this. We're seeing this with the Ukrainians who are fleeing Ukraine. But folks coming across our southern border are fleeing a lot of similar situations, and we need to meet them with the same generosity that we're showing and that we're feeling towards Ukrainians.
We're talking right now to Lindsay Kashgarian. She's program director of the National Priorities Project. They're very important because they take a look at who's spending what in our own government, the government that you and I own, by the way, not the other way around, even though it feels like it sometimes, and finding out that the budgets are prioritizing violence, military, war over peace and human needs. That includes vaccinations, that includes health care, that includes the things, despite the recent visit of President Obama for the first time since 2017 to the White House to help expand Obamacare. That part's good. But generally speaking, it is a militarized situation. I'll give you an example. You live in Los Angeles. I challenge anyone in the city of Los Angeles. I'm not talking about, up in Thousand Oaks or somewhere. But if you're in LA, let's just say West Hollywood or Hollywood, you will see a cop car every 90 seconds. Every 90 seconds. And you'll hear a siren probably every 4 minutes. But a cop car every 90 seconds. These cop cars is not Barney Fife with a no bullet in the chamber driving by, with a nothing in it. These things are souped up remainder military technology from Iraq and Afghanistan, a gift from Joe Biden, by the way. So he is not, as Mommy Dearest would say, the first time at this rodeo. He is the reason that all of that remainder military technology came from Iraq and ended up in our cop cars with these fully militarized vehicles with lasers and all kinds of crazy stuff. And they can take your life if you look at them the wrong way. If you're African American, it's really, truly scary. If you're not, it's scary. If that you know about it, it could happen to you too. This is real. We have a hyper-militarized police force, and we've all gotten used to it. And frankly, I want to vomit when I see militarized cop cars every 90 seconds. I'm just out trying to get a frozen yogurt. When I go in, sorry, I'm ranting here, Lindsay Kashgarian. But I go,
got a little laugh out of me there.
Well, I go into the Whole Foods on the corner of Fairfax and Santa Monica Boulevard. It's a Whole Foods. Like, what could be more of a sanctuary for anybody who tries to be a good person, right? I go in there. There's a guy in there who's armed, and he's not a PhD from Yale. He is a guy who may or may not speak any languages, drooling, nuts, maybe a meth addict with a sidearm. And if I grab the wrong persimmon, I could just get blown away on the floor. That's normal for us. Like, we don't even see it anymore. And so if our borders are doing that, and Title 42, maybe you can talk a little about that. If you listen to NPR, which is our sister chain here, you're going to hear them talk about Title 42. You won't hear them talk about it on Fox News, but you will hear it on NPR. And that is a special kind of love that Donald Trump gave us. Bring us up to speed on that, Lindsay Kashgarian.
Yeah, so Title 42 is what the Trump administration used to turn back immigrants because of the pandemic, because of the COVID crisis, and because immigrants coming across the border were allegedly a COVID threat. Of course, we had plenty of COVID inside the country, so they weren't bringing anything that wasn't already here. But the problem is that it's continued into the Biden administration, and they've actually defended this policy, and they're just now looking to reverse it. And it's like I said, there's nothing more to say about it than that COVID is already here. The U.S. has had one of the highest COVID rates of any country, one of the highest COVID death rates of any country, and so it's just not. It's a ruse. It's not really about COVID rates. It's really just about wanting to turn immigrants away at the border. And the program you were just talking about a minute ago, the one that sends the surplus military gear to our police departments, that program has sent $7 billion of military equipment to police departments, civilian law enforcement agencies over the last 20 years. That's more money than Congress is refusing right now for global vaccines. The Biden administration is trying to spend $5 billion to vaccinate the world. Congress doesn't want to do it, but we've spent $7 billion sending things like armored vehicles and, in some cases, grenade launchers, things that don't belong on city streets, to civilian law department.
I'm just, grenade launchers, things that just don't belong on city streets. I know it's not meant to be funny, but it's funny. Grenade launchers. We also have in Los Angeles tanks, and one was deployed to a school, a tank. Now, the LAPD didn't just suddenly have a tank. Oh, look, a tank. It was given a tank. And like any kid who's grown up and becomes a cop, but still a kid, like all kids, give me a tank, give me a this, give me a that. I'm going to use it,
Yeah, and in fact, they actually had a requirement that they had to use it. If they didn't use it, they had to give it back. So it encouraged them to use it. And then, you see police departments bringing out all this, all this riot gear and all these armored tanks and all these things you're talking about, to protests, to peaceful protests in a lot of cases. And that's one of the ways that it's been used is to squash peaceful protest.
Cary Harrison with you. This is the Harrison's Reality Check here on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles. You can get a copy, watch this video simply by going to goharrison.com or kpfk.org. A couple of hours after this broadcast, it'll be made available. You can also follow me on all social media at GoHarrison. And I just want to give a shout out to a really weird webinar that I watched that you might be interested in. If you go to vipwebinars.org, vipwebinars.org, that was the service that did our KPFK webinar for free for people that had donated during the last fund drive, vipwebinars.org at the front. It's an English language webinar by a former KGB spook named Daniel Estulin on the East-West collapse and what you'll need to know. So this is a guy from inside the Kremlin that recorded this just as the war was unleashing, and it is nothing less than horripilating. Plus, it tells you why the Russians are doing what they're doing to a great degree, some of which was what I was saying earlier. But you need to hear it from the horse's mouth. If you ever wanted to hear a KGB agent spill the beans who's living in another country, Mexico, and feels like he can just do that until he feels he cannot just do that, you'll want to go to vipwebinars.org and check out this webinar, The East-West Collapse, and what you'll need to know. We're talking right now to Lindsay Kashgarian, Program Director of the National Priorities Project. And do you have a website, Lindsay? People can check you out while they're listening to you talk?
We do. You can go and you can get your tax receipt. It's www.nationalpriorities.org.
My tax receipt?
That's right.
Really?
Actually, we haven't come out with your 2021 tax receipt is coming out soon, but you can go and get your 2019 tax receipt now.
God, I love you. Are you gonna have other stuff soon?
Yeah. We're working on the new tax receipt right now. It's going to be coming out for tax day this year.
Let's talk for a second about some bright spots, because I do, we all love a Hollywood ending. We know what happens when the movie ends dark and awful. Yeah, everyone watches it once, but they watch it once. If it's got a happy ending, they can watch it twice. We want people to watch a chain of events that could have a happy ending. And I'm very clear that we as citizens have to motivate the happy ending. It's not going to be a gift from a bunch of enlightened senators or Congress people, they need to hear from us over and over again what the right thing to do here. You talk, Lindsay Kashgarian, about the request cutting the number of beds dedicated to detention of immigrants, which is an inhumane policy that subjected immigrants to abusive and dangerous conditions. It also cuts a request for the troubled F-35 jet fighter by a third, slowing the flow of money to a behemoth weapons system. I'm quoting you here. I would sound otherwise ordinarily articulate, extraordinarily. Cuts the slowing the flow of money to behemoth weapons systems that has failed to meet the Pentagon's standards, and those standards are so high. That was a parent, opinion. These cuts show some willingness to break with policy that is immoral and doesn't work. Congress should maintain both of these cuts. So, what do we do to get their ear or keep them in that direction?
Well, you started off with the answer. You want to call your members of Congress and let them know that these two things are important to you. The budget that the military budget that the Biden administration is calling for is completely off the charts. It's, like you said, it's higher than the height of the Vietnam War. It's higher than the height of the Cold War. It's way more than we need to keep us safe. And in some ways, in fact, it's probably making us less safe. But there are these two things in the Biden budget that they did right. And one of them, like you said, is cutting the number of detention beds. These are, when we had family separation, when we saw children being put into cages, this is the kind of thing that we're talking about. This is detention of immigrants. They've been kept in unsafe conditions. They've gotten COVID. They've been served moldy food. It's inhumane. And cutting the number of those beds, the number of people who are in that situation is critical. And it's proposed in this Biden administration budget to cut the number of those beds from 34,000 to 25,000, which is still too many, but it's a big cut. So you need to call your member of Congress and tell them to keep that. The other thing you need to call your members of Congress and tell them to keep is a cut to the F-35 program. This is a program that report after report has found key critical problems with this jet fighter. It has spontaneously caught fire at least 3 different times, set itself on fire. It's not safe. It doesn't work. And finally, this administration is recognizing that and calling to buy fewer of these things. And so we need to call our members of Congress and insist that they actually cut back and stop throwing good money after bad by putting more money into this jet fighter.
I think one of the pitfalls we fall into, Lindsay Kashgarian, Program Director of the National Priorities Project, is we're not allowed in the U.S. to say it like it is. We have to find a more elegant, softer way of describing the obvious, and therefore it becomes opaque and not really what it really is. Putting children in cages is actually putting children in cages. Not the size of a spaniel's cage, for instance, but it's like a giant jail cell cage. And this is the Trump way of discouraging people to want to immigrate here. Those images are going to get out. This mistreatment of people is going to get out. And the idea is that the romantical nature of coming to the U.S. is going to get squashed. Otherwise, why do you do it?
It's true. It's, we call them detention beds, but it is putting people in cages. It's funny that they call them beds. The emphasis should not be on beds. The emphasis should be on imprisonment, losing your freedom, and living in these really inhumane conditions. And there have been, example after example after example of folks living in unsafe, unhygienic, like I said, moldy food, insecure, just conditions that no person should be put in, least of all somebody whose only crime is trying to come here and live a better life. So we need to stop the practice of detention entirely, but cutting back by 10,000 fewer people who will be put in that situation is 10,000 people. And that's a critical cut. We have to save those people from detention.
And let's end on a final point, Lindsay Kashgarian. I do appreciate your staying on a little longer, but I wanted a full perspective so that people had a proper meal to be able to digest in their information diet. Military intervention, you say, can't fix the world's problems, but that won't stop contractors and hawks from calling for more military spending. Half of the Pentagon funding in a typical year goes to for-profit contractors. Let me say that sentence again. It was so good. Half of Pentagon funding in a typical year, and we're talking hundreds of billions, half of that goes to for-profit contractors. Stock prices for weapons contractors have soared since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and weapons companies' leaders have been heard in Washington, D.C. on K Street and with their KY jelly, speaking of the invasion as a, quote, opportunity.
That's right. They're making money from this, and they know it, and they're not ashamed to say it. And they're not ashamed to go and argue for more money. But that money isn't preventing anything in Ukraine. It's already failed to prevent anything in Ukraine. It is not solving the situation in Ukraine. Very little of the money going to the Pentagon right now is actually addressing the Ukraine situation at all. Less than 1% of the money that went to the Pentagon last year was used directly to help Ukraine. So this is not.
Wait a minute. Stop. Did I hear that right?
Less than 1% of the money that went to the Pentagon last year directly helped Ukraine.
Okay, so 700 plus last year, right? Billion. Less than 1% went to help Ukraine.
That's right.
So 99% went to
somewhere else. And more than half, like you said, it's been year after year. Half of the money, hundreds of billions of dollars, half of the money that we give to the Pentagon goes directly to contractors. It's a huge industry. They have a huge interest. They have a huge lobbying presence in Congress. And that's the reason why these budgets are so high. It's not really because of our security. It's not because that money is doing something that's preventing war somewhere or keeping people safe here in the United States. It's because it's this huge industry, and there are people with deep, deep pockets who have a huge interest in making sure that dollar amount continues to go up.
It reminds us of one of the last, now popularly the last good Republican. I'm sure at the time he was pilloried, but Eisenhower, who warned of the giant gobsmacking, suction machine known as the military industrial complex, and warned all of us very seriously that it would take over and just eat up everything and become the new god. And at another conversation of his, he was asked, what is the biggest export that America has? Could have been corn, could have been a lot of things back then. He said it's business, and it's military business, because the Cold War was really good for the bottom line. And here we are again with the greatest gift on the planet. We have Russia invading Ukraine because of the 1990 agreement that James Baker made publicly on the stage to Gorbachev, which was very tricky. But he said, look, Mr. Gorbachev, that sounds like Ronald Reagan. I'm not doing the Gipper here. But he said, look, Mr. Gorbachev, here's the deal. If you dissolve the Soviet Union, we will... And allow Germany to reunite as to one Germany, we promise not to step not even 1 inch into any former Soviet territory with NATO, including never, ever, ever for any reason bringing Ukraine into NATO. So that puts us, the world's policemen, money-making, for-profit policemen, by the way, not policemen because it's the right thing to do in the neighborhood to keep old ladies from getting mugged. It's because you're paying people to do it. As the world's policemen, we can't actually go into Ukraine and do what we would love to do, but instead we can funnel billions of dollars of weapons that we get to produce from scratch. What a good deal, cynically speaking, as these guys are saying in Washington, D.C., which means there is no huge appetite to stop this thing per se.
No, it's true. The incentives are all wrong, and they have recognized. Raytheon's CEO talked about how this was going to be good for business, and that's the mindset. And the mindset is that they're going to they're going to provide weapons for this conflict and for any other conflict. And by the way, the U.S. is the world's largest exporter and provider of arms and arms sales to the world by far, by a long shot. We're number one. We sell the most arms. But we're not just sending them to Ukraine to defend themselves. We're sending them to Saudi Arabia, who's using them on Yemeni civilians and has been for years. And we keep giving them more weapons to use on civilians. And nobody's talking about that. Or nobody's talking about it enough. The role that our weapons play in doing, committing atrocities just like the ones that Putin is committing in Ukraine.
It's interesting that you say that, Lindsay Kashgarian, because here we're hearing all these calls for war crimes, and yet the U.S. and Russia do not belong. They are not members of the War Crimes Council. Why? Because people like George W. Bush and swinging Dick Cheney and a whole lot of others could get trumped up, so to speak, and put in shackles and hauled away for real war crimes, going back to the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, and not to mention all the other stuff that we do. So we simply don't belong. Likewise, Russia. Likewise, Israel. Also not keen on membership there. So we don't have to participate. So it's a double-edged sword, because now that we need it, now that it'd be a really good idea, we're not a member. So it's really not going to happen. So it sounds good on kind of nitwit news because people don't know how to research it and assume it's actually underway and going to happen, but only if the EU does something. And, good luck on that.
It's true. The U.S. has done a lot to undermine the what should be the power of international law, and that's on us. That's we have a powerful position in the world. We could make international law more legitimate if we wanted to, but those have not been the policy choices that our leaders have made for decades.
Well, I want to thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for staying long. But to me, this was just like a 5-layer lasagna. It was good. And I really appreciate it. We've been talking to Lindsay Kashgarian, Program Director of the National Priorities Project, just releasing a statement that Biden's 2023 war budget, really is what it is, puts war before human need. His budget request once again prioritizes violence, the military, and war over peace and human needs, spending $813 billion. You could landscape the whole nation and buy a yacht with that. So we now know what to do. When in doubt, dial out your congressman, congresswoman, your senator, your whatever lunatic is up there today.
Thanks.
Thanks for coming on. Cary Harrison with you. You can follow us anytime at goharrison.com, goharrison.com, where you'll be able to see a video of this interview with Lindsay Kashgarian, as well as my initial monologue. You can also follow me at Go Harrison. And I want to remind you, if you want a really shocking look, go to vipwebinars.org, vipwebinars.org, and check out this webinar by Dr. Daniel Estulin, former KGB spook and international best-selling author. He's doing a tell-all, the East-West collapse and what you'll need to know. Yikes is all I could say. It is well worth it. VIPwebinars.org. Coming up in just a second, we're going to be talking to Jerry Ashton. Speaking of military, the vets, the people that come back, our vets who came back from Iraq and Afghanistan. In Los Angeles alone, we have some 140,000 homeless people. A full 25% are military vets.
At 28, I had struggled with opiate and meth addiction for 12 years. I lost everything, and I still thought I was in control. And that's when a friend told me about Elite Rehab Placement. They found me a program that fit my needs. It was a small enough program that I could get that one-on-one attention, and they gave me the tools I needed to get sober.
Cary Harrison with you, and you may not realize this, But veterans who go and give their lives, and certainly the many that are out right now during these geopolitical tensions, may return and not get all the medicine they can eat from the VA. But wait a minute. I thought the VA gave all the free medicine that veterans deserved and were entitled to. Well, it's not the case. And if they have a headache or a broken arm that was not related to service, they have to go to a hospital like you and me, and they have enormous medical debt. A shock to many, but a cure perhaps to many more, thanks to a man named Cary Harrison, who's already gotten rid of $7 billion in regular people's medical debt and is now aiming to help our own veterans. Cary Harrison, I want to welcome you so much.
Well, I want to thank you for having me on your program. And this is a situation that needs more awareness. Nobody, at least I, even as a Navy veteran, I hadn't realized that I was subject to medical debt, provided that I didn't have a service-related illness or problem that caused that medical visit to a emergency ward or what have you. Everybody hears the stories about homeless veterans and veterans itself, and everybody wants to help veterans and veteran suicides. These shouldn't be happening to begin with. But very few people understand that veterans, on top of everything else that they encounter in this world, that they will be burdened by unpaid and unpayable medical debt, thanks to a broken system, a broken approach to the way that we treat the people who have put their lives on the line for you and me.
You know, you say that, Cary Harrison, and I think about how NATO is said to be never have been stronger than it is today. We have military in active service in huge numbers right now, vast numbers, with an expectation that if they get injured or when they return down the road, they get sick again, that they will be treated automatically. And we learned that it's not the case because of a broken system. So you have a system, an inverted or an adjacent system, we might say, to the system you used to get rid of over $7 billion in regular people's medical debt. And now you're focusing on the VA itself and veterans' medical debt.
That's right. What you're alluding to or referring to is RIP Medical Debt. That's a charity that I co-founded in 2014, whose mission when we started out was to take donations, take donations, go to the medical debt market, purchase medical debt for pennies on the dollar, and then once it was in our possession, we would slit its throat. We would forgive it legitimately with no tax consequences to the recipient. And while we were doing that, I kind of noticed that there were veterans that were being caught up in this medical debt forgiveness. I said, how does that happen? So my partner and I, Craig Antico, went down to Washington, D.C. We met with a subcommittee on veterans' health, where we were told, and this was a few years ago, that there was over $6 billion worth of unpaid medical debt incurred at emergency wards and other forms of care that was given by the general public to a veteran, but which was not reimbursed, not paid back to that hospital. You can imagine how that makes a hospital unhappy, but it certainly doesn't help the veteran, who then becomes a collection object for our healthcare system.
And these veterans, admittedly, are not in good shape to begin with. A full quarter of the homeless people in Los Angeles, of which there are 140,000, a full quarter are guys that have come back from Afghanistan, from Iraq, with head injuries and missing limbs. They're not in good shape to begin with. They often can't get jobs, and so throwing medical debt on top. You mentioned something interesting, Cary Harrison. You said without tax consequences, and people can't even relate. What does that mean? That they get their medical debt forgiven without tax consequences. So there's a special bonus that you throw in here.
Well, in RIP Medical Debt, because, and that's ripmedicaldebt.com if you'd like to look at my background and what we've done there. RIP Medical Debt is a 501c3 charity. And since a charity can forgive things, as a charity, it's a charitable act and therefore not taxable. That's the difference.
And you also remove people's negative credit mark, which means they could actually maybe go get a job because they don't have a negative credit mark. They could rent a car, they could get an apartment, things that might have been impossible before. So it has kind of a double dip meaning. And let's point out here, this is not an ask for money. This conversation we're having, this exposure, this spotlight on what you're doing to end medical debt.
It's End Vet Med Debt, and the organization, my organization that is causing this awareness campaign. It's not a money-raising campaign, it's an awareness-raising campaign. And in California and in Florida, two of the major states that have veterans, and in those states, California, for example, there are 18 million veterans in our country. 1.8 million of those are in California. 1.4 in Florida, 1.4 in Texas. Now, when you have a congregation of people who are veterans and they're getting older and they're like anybody else, they're going to need medical attention, whether it be an accident or an illness. The surprise for them, of course, is that if they have any reason to visit an emergency ward or something other than I would say, an accident or an illness that came about because of the military service, they're on the hook for that bill. There is no insurance for that veteran to be able to go back to the VA and say, please help me. Now, things are changing in that, but not changing fast enough. So if you go to endvetmeddebt.com or endveteranmedicaldebt.com, there's a
Petition.
Yeah, a petition. We have a petition that says to the VA, we want you very strongly to consider giving up all the medical debt that you have on your books that is unpaid and unpayable and make it available for forgiveness. It's not asking a lot. You can't collect on it anyway. Make that available for a charity like RIP Medical Debt to step in and forgive it totally. Now, the present VA program, by the way, that was announced with great fanfare, said we're going to forgive veteran debt. Well, not exactly. So, it's always the left hand giveth and the right hand taketh away. And what it really means is that if you're a veteran and you have unpayable medical debt, basically you have to petition for that. You have to request that. It's not given to you automatically. In our case, it would be given automatically because if you're 2 times the poverty level or you're putting out, say, 5% of your annual income for medical debt, you need to have help. And that help is the best in the form of forgiveness. So when you go to that website, there is a button that says, sign this petition. And that petition is going to go to the VA and get them awakened to the fact that a lot of people are getting upset about how our veterans are being treated. Now, early on, when I was starting RIP Medical Debt, we wrote a book called End Medical Debt. And quite recently, last year, we brought out the COVID edition. And in that, there's a chapter 5, and the chapter 5 says the title, No Thank You for Your Service. And it illustrates within that chapter that several people that we focus on who absolutely were abused by the VA system. Not because the VA system is so bad, it's just that it's encumbered by congressional oversight, it's encumbered by a budget that doesn't meet the needs of the veterans. Now, if you go to that website, endvetmeddebt.com, you click on that donate button, you will get a download free copy of that chapter. So you can, as a citizen, as a concerned citizen, you can see for yourself, read for yourself what the problems are.
So just to summarize, what you're doing, Jerry Ashton, is this more or less the same as what you did with RIP Medical Debt, where you successfully relieved $7 billion in regular people's medical debt, coast to coast, and removed their negative credit mark, which was impeding their chance to rent cars, fly on airplanes, get apartments, whatever they needed to do. So it restores them back to a level playing field. Now we have vets. You're going to the VA, you're going to the federal government and saying, look, there's all this debt that they can never collect on anyway. Your charity will buy that debt, pay it off, and clear the records of all these vets so they're on neutral territory once again and can actually heal and go forward, which is something I think we want for everyone. Certainly, if you have parents, they're probably vets, grandparents, 100%, and friends and relatives. And given today's geopolitical climate, you definitely know people that are involved. So this is a great campaign. And just to reset, you're not asking for money. All you're asking for is signatures. So enough people say something, the government ends up listening.
That they do, and I'm looking forward to them having all ears for this campaign.
At 28, I had struggled with opiate and meth addiction for 12 years. I lost everything, and I still thought I was in control. And that's when a friend told me about elite rehab placement. They found me a program that fit my needs. It was a small enough program that I could get that one-on-one attention, and they gave me the tools I needed to get sober.